Welcome everyone to Mindful's podcast, Point of View. I'm Barry Boyce, Editor-in-Chief of Mindful and mindful.org. And today I have the pleasure of talking with my good friend and colleague, Rhonda Magee. Rhonda's professor of law at the University of San Francisco. And she's a mindfulness teacher who's been focused for some years on issues having to do with mindfulness in the law, mindfulness for lawyers in their everyday work, justice, public policy, and in particular focusing increasingly on issues of inclusivity, in-group, out-group, bias, and is pioneering something she calls color insight, which we'll talk about later on. So welcome, Rhonda.
Thank you very much, Barry. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, so you and I met for the first time quite a few years ago now, it must be, at a retreat in Kalamazoo, Michigan, out in a beautiful forest. And I recall we had an opportunity to take a couple of walks around there. And, I get to know each other, and I got a good chance to begin to know you. I'd like, if you don't mind, if you could tell a little bit of your background for our listeners, how you grew up and where you grew up, and then work your way towards how you ended up practicing mindfulness.
Well, thank you. So I grew up in the South. I was born in 1967, right? So 50 years on the planet. 50 good years, I would say. Well, the last few have been more challenging than many in the past, I'll say. So born in the South, born at a time when, actually in the last year of Martin Luther King's birth. So right at the kind of a very poignant time in American history where we were bringing the civil rights movement kind of to, in a certain sense, a kind of peak in terms of articulating the promises of a movement for inclusivity that would be supported by law and public policy and might change the culture. And so I think my own journey here was influenced in some not insignificant way by the fact that I was born then and there, raised in a family that was mostly, that was Christian, and particularly influenced by a grandmother and others in the family who were deeply committed to religious practice and to a kind of a discipline of daily, what they would call prayer and study, but look very much like kind of daily meditation discipline, if you will. So witnessing as a little girl, seeing my grandmother practice every day, get up in the morning before dawn, commit herself to a kind of centering, and then going out in the world and working very hard. She didn't have a glamorous job. She cleaned houses for other people and took care of the family. And then on the weekends, helped to support community. She had become herself a lay minister in a particular Christian tradition. So I grew up then in a family that was already kind of deeply engaged in the idea of practice and daily practice for one's own sustenance in a world that wasn't necessarily, in fact, created for our thriving, but also to support us in the work of trying to make the world as livable and kind as possible for ourselves and for our communities. So I moved from North Carolina to Virginia, did most of my schooling in Virginia, went to the University of Virginia, studied law and sociology at the graduate level, and then ended up teaching at the University of San Francisco. For me, mindfulness came in part in a kind of, first of all, I think it was an organic way in which I was always very drawn to solitude and drawn to my own, developing inner work. and found mindfulness in particular, or meditation, I should say first, in 1993, the year I came out from San Francisco, or from the South to San Francisco, and really just on the one hand, at this moment of new opportunity, I was starting a new job as a lawyer, having trained and focused and done all these different things, but also was in this brand new place with everything around me sort of new and different, and starting this fancy job at a law firm that also, because I was the only African-American, only young woman of color at the time in an office of about 70 or so lawyers, I just already knew there were going to be some additional challenges that would come with that beyond the everyday challenges of being a young lawyer. So I felt at that time a need to make more consistent and committed my own personal practice regimen, and so started exploring actually ways of deepening my own ground, my own sources of inner support that were more aligned with who I had become by then. I'm still very inspired by Christ's message and teachings. And yet at the same time, for me, I kind of needed a way of entering into a spiritual journey that was a little more sort of informed by practices that specifically would assist me in working with my own mind, knowing my own kind of conditionings and habits, and specifically putting myself in a position to deal with stress and to deal with the ways that my own reactivities and ways of being in the world might make for more suffering than I needed to endure. So I was drawn to meditation. I was drawn to mindfulness, and from there just developed a regular practice that led me to teaching and training through a variety of wonderful teachers, including Norman Fisher, a former abbot of the San Francisco Zen Center, who's been a teacher of mine for years. And then actually more recently, 10 or 12 years ago, became affiliated, met John Kabat-Zinn along the way, and through his inspiration, prepared myself for mindfulness-based stress reduction intervention type teaching by going through the teacher training program at the Center for Mindfulness, Oasis Center for Mindfulness. So that's in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, that's a beautiful nutshell. And it seems to me that you grew up in what we might call today in the jargon an intentional community. Was it your grandmother, you say? Or,
yes.
Who was, a lay minister, and is it fair to say that you derived a lot of strength from that community growing up?
Yeah, I mean, it is fair, and it's also fair to say that the community was very, had its back up against the wall in many ways, right? So it was still very segregated. Like my kindergarten school, despite the fact that it was by then 1972 when I was entering kindergarten, it was still officially segregated in the South. Nothing had changed, despite Brown versus Board.
Yeah, well, and I mean you say, well, during the Jim Crow period, as if that ended.
Way back there. Right. So it's right. It still continues, and yet it had a certain kind of flavor when it was completely and in very intensive ways supported and endorsed by our legal system and by our police and by our churches. Right. So there is, while segregation continues actually in a way that I do think it's important to really be clear about, the difference between the kind of very official commitments and explicit endorsement of white supremacy that was in place throughout, even starting my lifetime, between what was in place then and what's in place now, which is not as much. We're re-entering, I would say, a period where people are re-embracing white supremacy in a way that actually is quite, it's meaningful and important. We need to talk about that. It's part of why I do the work that I do. But yeah, I had this period in my life where really the dominant message was to kind of respond and redress white supremacy, to make a society that was fair. And I wouldn't be here if we hadn't gone through that period, right? Where we had a civil rights movement that led to changes in public policy, that led to opening up of educational opportunities for people like me, that literally weren't there before, actually dismantling to a degree the patterns of segregation that had been in place that are resurfacing today, right? So I think part of what needs to be understood is we actually did make a lot of change. Led to me being literally here in this conversation with you, led to electing Barack Obama as president, and many other things. And we are now, I think, really at a moment societally where all of that change is facing really probably the most intense backlash that I've ever seen in my lifetime. And so mindfulness for me increasingly became a support for looking clearly at what needs to be seen with regard to those issues. I was already teaching a class dealing with race and law. I have taught such a class at the University of San Francisco and other places, William and Mary College in Virginia, and where I visited. But my main place has been at USF, and there, very diverse groups of students from new immigrant families, first generation students from all over the world, African American, white students, all coming together to try to learn American legal history and the way in which race and bias has been a feature of our history for since the founding.
Yeah, I'd like to return to that topic a little later on in a deeper way. First, I want to talk a little bit about community. As you said, you were in a community that had its back up against the wall.
Yes.
And yet managed to derive some strength in the middle of that struggle. Yes. And even including in the face of real hate, mm-hmm. An
yes.
ethos of love and turning the other cheek, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a bit of incredible bravery there.
Yes.
I think for a lot of people, mindfulness is something that, well, really for anybody, I think would be strengthened by community. And we are now in our 5th anniversary. In fact, this podcast is our 5th anniversary celebration podcast. So you've been chosen.
Yay! Thank you.
To lead that off. And
my honor. Thank you.
We're using this slogan of mindfulness for all. And yet, in many ways, mindfulness practice seems to be a phenomenon of the mainstream privilege culture, even though there are a number of good programs that are breaking down some barriers. But, there's a lot more barriers to be broken down, obviously, before we could say that mindfulness feels like something that is truly accessible to all. Could you say something about what you think the barriers are to greater inclusion and a bigger spectrum of mindfulness practitioners?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it links, I do think, in important ways to this notion of community. I do think that the kind of experience that I shared about growing up in a world where I was very sort of aware of suffering, right? It wasn't an abstraction. And the idea of finding support for dealing with suffering and then realizing that this is not a personal project, that indeed, we do what we do for ourselves, but we do it in community always. We're always embedded in community. That was something that I was that was always very apparent to me. And so for me, when I look at the kind of Western mindfulness scene, I do think a barrier to allowing its rich potential to infuse and enrich the lives of broader and broader swath of our human population, our human family. A barrier to that is the way that it's taught in the midst of a society that hasn't reckoned with racism, sexism, and all the other isms very well, right? So part of the way in which we haven't reckoned with those things is to hyper-focus on individualism, right? To kind of disconnect, denude our experience from its embeddedness in community and culture, right? So that is kind of hand in glove with racism, sexism, homophobia, all of that, is to sort of deny the relevance of culture, of community, of history. And mindfulness has been a bit, not intentionally, but again, because deep in our our structures of this society, of Western societies, and many societies in the world right now, are kind of hidden ways of perpetuating the status quo, including perpetuating racism, sexism, etc. And one of those sort of subtle ways is to hyper-focus on the individual. It's not about sex or race or culture. It's really about you as an individual and whether or not you can overcome. And again, through no intentional fault of its own, I think mindfulness has been taken up in the midst of that culture. This is
so what you're really saying, the first thing you bring up here, in terms of barriers, it's very interesting. This is kind of a very deep and subtle barrier of making it a personal improvement project. Is that really what you're saying?
Absolutely.
That doesn't begin with you as a social
being
with who embodies a culture as part of a culture. Is that really what you're driving at?
Yeah, it absolutely. It begins with the personal improvement process. And the difficulty is that there is a very important role for the personal improvement project. That's the difficulty. The difficulty is that absolutely focusing on individual efforts, practice, and so on is really essential to I think, mindfulness, to the liberatory potential of mindfulness, the freedom that can come from that. It's essential for us to have personal commitments. The problem is that in our society, it's sort of either or. It's either about the personal or it's about the social. And yet I think if we can open to our own experience, we know we're always already both individuals in a world. And I think, again, the challenge is to sort of convey mindfulness as about a practice for individuals in a world, in communities, in systems. So it's the kind of in a more nuanced and profound way, bring mindfulness forward as it is, which is a support for individuals embedded in communities and systems that are constantly a part of, right, what it is that we struggle with, what sets us up for the particular kinds of suffering that we endure. So it's to kind of deepen, move us away from this tendency to only focus on the individual and to infuse it. It's individual and community, it's both and. And mindfulness, I think, because it opens up our capacity to see things through multiple lenses at once, has a profound ability to help us, and in that sense, lead Western culture forward. Because I think our entire culture suffers from these false dichotomies, right? The inability to see the world through multiple lenses at once, to deal with that kind of complexity in a world beset with more and more complex problems.
So that is a very fundamental barrier that we could contemplate for quite a while. And I'd like to see if you could, if there are any other discrete barriers and that you could mention or that come to mind. And then I'd like to ask you about some practical first steps that might help to loosen those things up. In addition to just what you already said about contemplating that dichotomy and the unavoidable fact of being an individual and a communal person at the same time. So what are some other barriers that come to mind for you?
Yeah. So, relatedly, we largely continue to live in very segregated communities and cultures and systems. And that's a fact that is kind of, again, one that we struggle to keep coming back to. We know that part of the way we've been taught to look at these issues is that we were segregated officially.
Right.
And now we're not. And now if communities are racially identifiable or culturally distinct, it's all a matter of choice. It's all, a matter of the market. It's not about patterns or conditioned habits and also structures, the way we do schooling, public and private, the way we continue to structure our religious communities. We tend not to really see how we are very, very, very deeply still embedded in and committed to, actually. We have a taste for, it seems like, segregation. And that those structures
we reinvest in boundaries that we think we've gone beyond. Mentally in our media, we reinvest in those boundaries.
We really do.
That you are more different from me than is really the case.
Yes. And we reinvest, meaning we send our kids to schools that are still very isolated. We move around the country. I live in San Francisco. I hear people find various and sundry different ways to explain why they leave a very diverse region. And often my white friends, for example, find themselves in much more white spaces after the stresses of the city.
Right.
Sometimes this racial piece of it is mentioned, often not widely, but maybe in these quiet conversations. I had a young woman come and talk to me about a friend of hers. It's often, I'm speaking about a friend, not myself, but a friend of hers. This young woman was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, and she had another friend, an immigrant from Eastern Europe, who came to San Francisco and said she wanted to move away because she wanted to be around more Americans. And by that, she actually meant more whites. There still is a way that when we part of the legacy of white supremacy in America is that we've, defined what it means to be American still in the eyes of many, both domestically and internationally, as white. And that is what we're still up against. It's what, we have been seeing emerge in the political culture and the discourse around making America great again. There's a deeply embedded desire, or kind of a way in which we keep moving into segregation and reinforcing it, reinvesting in it, as you say. And that is, again, part and parcel of, we're all in that world. So even as mindfulness organizations are built up, our networks are already very segregated, right? All of our networks for reaching out, finding potential teachers, finding, people to come to our organizations, our events, they're already very segregated. And so we are up against that challenge of, again, living in a society that's already structured to push us apart. And those dynamics are coming from so many different institutions that it's actually very hard for any institution to start reaching out to adults, adult learners, adult practitioners, and saying, let's come together from these very different, places of relative segregation and isolation. So that's a concrete way to address that is, there are short-term steps, but I actually think the longer-term cultural change is what has to happen. You just have to, and this this effort must outlive our own lifetimes. It will, right? We have to get with this. Another problem we deal with in the West is very short-term focus. And if we can't imagine our efforts realizing some gain tomorrow or at the outside 6 months from now, we're not sure it's worth our time. We are not going to change these patterns in this country that took hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to embed without a commitment to changing them that is at least as farsighted. It must be.
So are you suggesting that if you have too much of a hunger for immediate results, you won't really commit to? You mean if you really have to take on that notion that, we're planting seeds in a garden that we will not see flower?
Yeah.
I hadn't really thought of it that way, that it's a way, if you say, well, I need you silently in your mind, you think you want to see a short-term gain, you just give up. Okay, well,
yes, it's very easy to get frustrated.
This neighborhood isn't going to change, and
this community isn't going to change. This meditation group isn't going to change. That's very helpful. Well, keep going. Yeah, so we need both a very long-term commitment and a lot of patience, both of which I think are gifts for me of my own mindfulness practice. And not that I've gotten there, right? I'm a work in progress just like everybody else. But to be able to sit with the frustration that comes with, oh, here we are again, trying to address this same issue of the denial of white supremacy in our history with people who, once again, don't want to talk about it. It's frustrating. That's an example. How
does patience square with the possibility of falling into apathy or not being willing to call somebody on something, which you are willing to do?
Yeah. So it's both and again. It's both, realizing there's a time for and a place in our own being in the world for patience. And there are times for and a place for being in action. And it's not either or. It really is both. So there are ways we can call people into conversations about white supremacy with compassion for the fact that we all kind of are in this together. We have all been trained away from this conversation. So it's going to be hard. It's going to, have to go by fits and starts and be interrupted, maybe even for years in a single organization because we're not ready for it yet. So it's really, I honestly think that to really deal with these issues is, high pay grade level mindfulness work. It isn't for, people who have not really come to see the depth of what it means to see clearly, what it means to work with our own conditionings, to sit in the fire of the painful recognition that, oh, my mind actually does orient me to people who look like me. Oh, I do feel safer. Honestly, I wish I didn't, but in fact, I do feel safer when I'm in these places. Mindfulness can help us with a lot of the really subtle difficulties of doing the work that must be done to dismantle these patterns and habits that draw us to reinvest in segregation. Mindfulness, compassion practices, these actually can help. So it's actually, it's both that kind of patience that comes with a mindful holding of a multi-generational looking back and forward at the same time type of project, because we are both looking at our particular histories, how we got here, and trying to imagine a future for our children and our children's children that will be much different. And then try to work towards that future, in part by trying to redeem our past, looking at the role our particular communities, our particular families, our cultures have had in setting us on this journey that we're on that keeps pushing us in corners and polarizing us. What's been the role of our family, our culture, my neighborhood, my own conditioning in those tendencies. How can I address those? And at the same time, realize that we're not going to address them overnight. We can't. It will not happen overnight. We didn't get here overnight. But we can take steps. We can take steps.
You know, as you're talking, I'm about how we feel more comfortable in certain spaces. It reminds me of what some of the fabric of culture is made of, and cultures are made of ways of being together. They're made of language, and you know, there's a principle called the high context communication that say within your family in North Carolina, you know, you have a particular way of talking and being and communicating that everyone understands together. And if you bring somebody else into that, they feel awkward.
Right.
And, you know, how do we deal with the power of cultures and yet try to do something that's transcultural? You know, that do we need to create some embryonic mindfulness communities that we are at first maybe artificially structuring so that there are more types of people involved, so that it, you know, I don't know. What do you understand what I'm driving at? And
I do.
And I know that you, you know, you've been a longtime board member of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, has, you know, some very big aims in terms of, you know, helping to transform all sorts of systems with mindful awareness. So anyway, how would you respond to what I'm talking about there?
Yeah, So I thank you for this question. I think that it is getting at really the deep challenge that we're talking about. You know, I'm a teacher in many different senses. As one example, I get to have 14 weeks with one group of students. But I've developed a course that I teach, for example, over 14 weeks, one called Contemplative Lawyering, one called Race and Law, Race and American Legal History. And in both, I've been allowed by the institution that I work in, not everybody's gotten this kind of permission wherever they might be, to actually bring mindfulness and compassion practices together with looking at, you know, the legal structures that support and that support both oppression and may support, you know, fighting for a more just world. So in that, what I do in those classes for 14 weeks is help the students develop a kind of community, a kind of new way of being with the suffering that they have seen, naming it, or having the language to speak. So emotional intelligence, having the language to talk about what suffering looks like from their high context, and to try to translate that into something that others in that room, a very diverse group, can understand and find their way into from their own high context position, their position of difference.
Yeah.
So what we do in those 14 weeks is really try to practice this. But I do think something along the lines of those kinds of intentional engaged communities where we say this group of people is going to meet on a regular basis. And so I, like others, you know, John Paul Lederach, who's a internationally known peacemaker, right, a practitioner of peace and writer about peace studies. You know, he's talked about how we have to have these conversations with each other that we're willing to stay in for a lifetime. Like meet somebody for coffee that will start a conversation that will last for the rest of our lives. I mean, that's ultimately what I think we need to do. How, you know, so there are going to be many small ways of doing that. An 8-week course that's focused on coming together regularly, a 14-week course, a year-long course. a community gathering space where we drop in, we drop out, but we know we're building the capacity to do this together and to come together. So I don't think there's one way to do it, but I do think once we start having this kind of conversation, where we start seeing there's a need for both a kind of intentional commitment to community that is about trying to open the doorways into our different ways of being based on our particular context, our particular cultures, and connect across them. There's so many ways to do that once we decide that's what we want to do. But I think the first step is to see the imperative. We live in the 21st century, a radically diverse world and country right now, our own America, but interconnected with a world whose cultural and other differences are very, very profound. And yet we have never developed the intentional kinds of technologies, if you will, that address in deep ways what it means to bring people together across those cultures. I think mindfulness and compassion can help with that.
Well, I think one of the things I hear you recommending here is that, I mean, in addition to long-term patience and short-term persistence, is to that maybe there are possibilities for the kind of embryos I was talking about, in the sense that your semester is a time and a place and a container where if we're in that container, we can't hide.
Yeah.
And with mindfulness, we have an opportunity to engage with some kindness and compassion, the ways in which we invest in separateness.
And also just learn from each other and live the experience of togetherness. We don't have a lot of it. We don't have a lot of experience to draw on.
Yeah, actually, that's interesting, because if you're living that experience, you actually can get some rewards from it. It begins to taste and feel good to you.
Absolutely.
You want more of that, and that I hadn't really appreciated.
This is very, very true. This I think is the heart of it. I mean, this is why desegregation and integration, when it worked, and I will say I think it worked in my own experience in many ways. Policies of bringing people together. You know, I was thrown into a school that was affirmatively trying to kind of be bussed for desegregation and all of that. But it was at a time when the community had stopped resisting, like publicly, right? So there weren't people out in the streets, parents saying no. We were going to school together. That meant we went to band class together. That meant we took French classes together, meaning whites, African Americans, and the 10 or 12% of other, right? In the South, it was mostly black and white, and a small percentage of so-called other, so people from a variety of different backgrounds. But we were in those close spaces, working together and learning from it in a way that actually was joyful. And I do think that is what my students experience in those classrooms. I know. I mean, I've had students, married people, find them to move from, I couldn't imagine dating outside my group, to I've now married a person from a totally different culture. And it was because of what happened in that class that made it possible for me to do that. So I do know that there is the heart of this is joy. I do think that we don't understand how we're all missing out on the joy of rich human community. We think that the greatest benefit is what we've been told is, right? How to make the pie bigger for our own, how to make sure my children, have one step ahead of other people. These are the things that we've been taught to fight for, to strive for. We haven't had enough experience with another kind of powerful means for success, which is what it means to be in rich, diverse, culturally nuanced community. We just don't know that, most of us, and therefore we're afraid of it.
So I think that's an excellent jumping off point for talking about color blindness. And you firmly reject that idea of color blindness in favor of what you call a term you've coined, color insight. And can you describe the difference between those two, Rhonda?
Yeah, so color blindness is this idea that And it comes from a beautiful place, I think, but it's the idea that the way to get beyond bias is to just not see it, not talk about it, not recognize ever, as much as possible in our public discourse, not to recognize that these differences exist. In fact, our brains don't operate that way. Of course, we know differences exist, right? We've been raised in a world that has taught us a lot about what these differences mean. So whether we're talking about race or gender, we notice these things. And
I think you may have used this practical example with me before at one point, the kind of, you could say that law is colorblind, but then when you're in a courtroom, your brain, your mind can perceive that there is, in that young black defendant, there's a palpable weakness against the system represented by the bench and all of it.
Exactly. So that is the question. How do you deal with the fact that we do notice these things, and yet our culture has been telling us, don't mention it, don't talk about it. In fact, if you raise it, you might be called racist. If you turn us toward that, you might be part of the problem. That might be divisive. It's a very interesting thing that we did over the last generation. I will say it happened over the last generation, although that's a kind of an oversimplification of it. But we got this beautiful language from Martin Luther King, right? His "I Have a Dream" speech. He wants a world in which his children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And there's been a sort of a cynical way that beautiful aspiration, which for King was always embedded in a knowing of the depth of the way in which we do see each other through race and through those lenses. That was taken as a kind of a clarion call to simply put these issues in a box and not talk about them, not ever recognize them, not take data, not gather data around race anymore, right? So there are many different ways that this idea of color blindness has shown up in public policy and in law, the idea of it. The reality, though, is when you go into a criminal courtroom in San Francisco, I've had a friend of mine who teaches juvenile justice and has a clinic for helping law students go in and represent young juveniles who are threatened with conviction. She's relayed to me how her students have come to her with these sad stories of young black or brown juvenile who's entering into those courtrooms in San Francisco. And this one story in particular stands out for me where the young juvenile entering the system leans over to their student representative, law student, who's trying to develop a way of dealing with the system, trying to support this young person. The juvenile leans over and says, "Where's the court for white kids?" Because all of the kids in this system around them are brown or black.
Wow.
And they know white kids are getting into trouble and doing the same kinds of stuff, but they're not in here. So that is what this sort of way in which we've tended to mute our conversation. It's not that we don't see or understand or perceive the world around race. We've just silenced ourselves around it. And that is what color blindness has really meant. Color, inability to kind of awkwardness, right? Inability to talk about it. Not that we don't see it. So there's that. There's the way in which that term doesn't actually track reality. And there's also a bit of a kind of a critical response to the use of colorblind, because the disability rights community, for example, has pointed out that there's a way in which there's already an ignorance, if you will, around the capacities of people who are not sighted. And we don't want to use blindness to associate it with this other kind of ignorance if we can avoid it. So there are many ways that people have said, let's really look at this language of colorblind. In fact, what we're talking about is color evasion, denial of the reality of these aspects of our lives, and enforced awkwardness and enforced silencing. And for me, an alternative really is to develop our capacities to actually effectively address these issues. I have used the phrase color insight to point to the way in which, again, our groundedness in mindfulness and compassion practices, and in the capacity to just sit in silence for some periods of our lives, moments of the day, moments of an interaction, and try and really develop a sense of insight. What is going on here? That the metaphor of insight, if you will, is something that I think is important to be brought to bear as a counterpoint to blindness, if you will, that we have been, raised up with in the last generation.
So how does that tie into mindfulness? How can mindfulness practices help cultivate this kind of insight, ability to see difference and yet begin to transcend in some sense?
Yeah. Well, again, it will go back to my own way of thinking about mindfulness, which is not just this short-term, very personal self-improvement intervention. It is about having a regular daily commitment to a kind of practice that is about awakening and awareness in a very deep way that is ongoing for one's life. Mindfulness is about really cultivating the capacity to be present to reality, to this moment, but to see it as embedded in a kind of a context. Then mindfulness is, I think, a way of being with this part of reality, right, in a more profound way. And so it's seeing mindfulness, first of all, in this richer, deeper way. It's not limited to these personal daily practices for clarifying the mind, for productivity. It is those things, and then deepening our capacity to see the interconnectedness of all, right? The way in which my being able to sit for 5, 10, 20, 30 minutes a day is tied to a certain kind of structure of convenience that is not open to everybody. So in other words, there are ways that our practices can really enhance and open up our capacity to see interconnection everywhere, and our capacity to be with suffering on a long-term basis. And these are the kinds of insights and skills that are essential to this work of dismantling on a long-term basis the patterns that lead to bias and oppression.
So to the extent that the somewhat over-popularized view of mindfulness, and it's great that mindfulness is becoming popular.
Yes.
But there is a kind of a dominant mainstream cultural vibe that's developing that associates it with kind of escaping. It's just time out. But you're suggesting that it very much also needs to be time in,
yes,
where you really now, you have the capacity to look with less fear and more openness. And I
very
think,
well said. Yes.
yeah, I think that does tie back to, your semester, where if you do that in community, you get a little bit of a bravery
Yes.
from peers doing it.
Yes.
Don McCown, who teaches mindfulness in Philadelphia, is very much of the mind that mindfulness is a group practice. It's very, and mindfulness-based interventions are done in groups.
Yes.
And people have opportunities in those structures to reveal themselves in very important ways.
Yes, I would agree with that entirely.
I think that, you and I both know Cheryl Petty.
Yes.
We did a conference together with Cheryl down in Virginia.
Absolutely.
And, I'm paraphrasing something that Cheryl said, but, she was basically sharing with us or with me in any way, that folks who know equity work deeply, who know about the deep historically embedded sources of systemic bias and racism, such as you've been talking about, they don't tend to know much about mindfulness.
It's true.
It hasn't infiltrated that academic community all that much and activist community all that much. And on this, by the same token, people who know mindfulness deeply don't know much about deep historical ingrained tendencies, and might have a tendency to overlook those kinds of things and think that, well, if you're just aware and kind, then everything's going to be fine.
It's true.
I'm not doing anything racist right now. I'm just meditating.
Right.
Cheryl was suggesting these two need to get together somehow.
Absolutely. Cheryl and I are very much on the same page about this.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, I just would say I think Cheryl's insight there is right on. It is absolutely true. Again, part and parcel of the way our society isolates, silos, right? We kind of get into our line of discourse, and we often fail to see some of the ways that we need to connect with other, our mindfulness discourse over here does need to find its way into a conversation with social justice activists, people who are trying to change the world, and vice versa, right? That social justice discourse actually needs to kind of infuse, get connected up, be a part of the mindfulness movement. I think this is, again, where patience is essential, even though we want this change to happen right now. It's not easy. I speak from the position of one who's been seeking to bring these two discourses and communities of practice together for 20 years, maybe 10 years explicitly, 20 years implicitly, right? But I've been doing this work for long enough to see it's really hard. And it's hard for reasons that are totally predictable, meaning I completely understand why, if you've been raised in a world of social justice activism, you may not have come across mindfulness and these other ways of being with our conditioned, our habits and practices and reactivity. You might not have that might not have been a part of how you got into social justice activism. And similarly, I completely understand how being brought into Western mindfulness may not have come through the door of social justice activism and awareness around those things. I get it. But when you really get it, you start to see with some compassion that if we're going to make a difference around these things, we have to refine what we're doing, deepen our capacity to reach out even in the most difficult places, and to stay in connection despite frustration that will inevitably arise when we feel like we're not moving fast enough, and so on and so forth. So this is really, I think Cheryl's comment there is really spot on. And it would require, again, I can imagine a world where a generation or two from now, we are teaching social justice, as has begun to be the case, not only in my class, but in other classes. Beth Barilla is teaching anti-oppression work around gender and so on, through the lens of mindfulness and compassion. Others around the country are starting to do this. I can imagine our children might be invited into classes that both heighten their awareness of social injustice and what it means to fight against oppression, but also are supported with some kind of practices, whether we call them mindfulness or otherwise. And similarly, I can see training for mindfulness teachers. In fact, I know that's also starting to happen. But I can imagine a generation from now that when we train teachers in mindfulness, part of that training is a rich, deep look at who that teacher is in terms of their own conditionings around these social identity issues of race, of gender, of immigration status, of disability, of class. The way in which mindfulness teachers are trained, right, ultimately, I think, needs to be infused with this understanding as well.
I think in this conversation that the three of us were having, and I'm remembering, I a practical example that came up, and this reminds me of something you said earlier about people having the time and luxury to meditate, or
Yes.
I think somebody was talking about a program for social activism where there was a mindfulness-based program, and there was total silence at all the meals, and it was an artificial imposition of a structure
Right.
that was not inviting.
Right.
And we have to proudly examine, again, talking about creating these embryos, we have to examine all the assumptions about what we think is absolutely required to make a certain kind of mindfulness space or retreat.
I think that's so true. I think that's absolutely true. And that, again, we don't do overnight, and we don't accomplish, with a workshop, or these are deep patterns of change, right? This is what structural change looks like, to start to say, how are we actually setting up, or what are the assumptions about what we need to do for this to be about mindfulness that might actually be off-putting to many of the people we would want to feel at home here. So there are people like Ed Ing, who's a mindfulness, kind of a Buddhist, a cultural heritage Buddhist, who has been actually criticizing some of what the Western mindfulness movement has brought to bear. And one of the lines of critique that he's made that I think is worthy of amplification is how it is that we have tended not to look closely enough at how some of the traditions from which mindfulness emerged, Buddhism as it's practiced, include not just sitting meditation and sitting in silence and those kinds of trainings that we associate with preparation for being a monk, or the kind of deep immersion that a certain element in Buddhism has been a certain that has been picked up. It's an aspect of Buddhism that has been identified in Western mindfulness as like what mindfulness means, the sitting practices. Very important. But if you listen to heritage Buddhists, people who have come from cultures which have been infused with these practices for a very long time, they talk about the work of coming together, shelling peas together, cutting and preparing the food for a meal together, sitting together in a way that is infused with the fact that we are in a human community together. So it can be partly in silence, of course, but also infused with loving connection. And so that, again, would take me back to the kind of community I grew up in, where it wasn't about what we called mindfulness, or it wasn't from a Buddhist tradition, certainly, but we really were embedded in a sense that we held hands, for example, when we got together. It was very common that when we would come together, at some point, there would be actual physical contact, which, again, for people whose backs are up against the wall, which I would say in a certain sense, all humankind is feeling this sense of bereftness of what it means to be embedded in loving community. Being able to actually, in appropriate ways, reach out and connect. And again, if we need social psychology and neurobiology to affirm this, it's doing so, right? The research is confirming the importance of just human touch. And so there are just a lot of different ways that we could, as you say, examine the assumptions we bring, and then it could show up in different things that we do when we come together in mindfulness gatherings.
It's interesting. I think in terms of Buddhism and mindfulness, there's a way in which, in it coming to the West, lots of parts of a bigger spectrum of Buddhism have been stripped away. At the same time, there's also a way in which Buddhists can also be kind of reactionary almost in feeling that Buddhism possesses mindfulness,
Yes.
in the sense that mindfulness is actually a basic human trait,
Mm-hmm.
and there are many traditions that have
Mm-hmm.
cultivated mindfulness, and so
Mm-hmm.
that I think we need to work at that from both ends. Speaking,
Again.
from a point of view of a magazine and a website that's committed to bringing, cultivating mindfulness and mind training in public context where,
I agree.
religion per se needs to be, let's say, left at the door. But what doesn't need to be left at the door is sacredness,
Right.
community,
Yes.
fundamental values that, and I think that,
Yes.
any pushing away of that, either for religious or secular reasons, is problematic.
I completely agree. And again, you're touching on the challenge. It's not that, um, you know, Buddhism needs to be brought. I do know that some people believe that, we solve this by kind of bringing Buddhism back in, so to speak, into mindfulness. But I think that would be, in my view, a kind of oversimplification of what the challenge is.
Yeah.
So we can both recognize, these various different streams of Buddhism and the various different manifestations of it, the cultural heritage piece of it that needs to be honored, and the diversity within and amongst all of those things, without then saying that the answer to the challenges that we face in mindfulness and in bringing in a sense of community and connectedness is to bring Buddhism fully back into in. I don't think that's what we need. I do think, though, it means, like, as you say, really looking at what's the rich, deep, underlying set of values and ethical commitments that have been at the core of inner work, whether we call it Buddhism or centering Christianity or whatever it is, Islam. There are core ethical and I would say, values-based commitments that have a certain set of things in common. And I think when you and I met at that retreat so many years ago, I think part of the purpose of that was to try to look at what is in common across all of these different traditions. And so that is a conversation I am always up for. I do think, again, it's another way into this conversation about dealing with difference while recognizing sameness all at once.
I think that, that relates a bit to the color blindness thing in the sense that, roots matter, and that there's a good tradition that's developing in Canada now that at most public gatherings of some kind now, or, well, certainly many, I don't know if it's yet most, there will be a statement at the beginning respecting that we're on Aboriginal land.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
there's a, quality, just that little bit of indication at the beginning that kind of transforms your thinking, like, or if I think about your grandmother, her roots are a big part of who she is. And if you just think, well, everybody's kind of basically the same. We all shop at the Piggly Wiggly. That's, you have to listen to somebody's deep roots.
Yes. I mean, there is a set of teachers that I've certainly been mindful of some of the wisdom that's coming out of the Canadian context, but just this idea certainly of honoring roots and honoring lineage, and also, again, being able to deal with the good, the bad, and the ugly that comes with looking at our lineage, not, sugarcoating it, but to really recognize that, first of all, we all have some lineage, and that as we deepen our capacity to honor where we have come from and how we end up here together, we do enrich who we are from that. We do, I think, strengthen our capacity to go forward with brokenheartedness and with joy, right? All of that is going to come up when we really get more real about who we are. I honestly feel that is really a kind of a potential gift and benefit of mindfulness that we haven't quite figured out how to talk about, quite figured out how to see or live our way into. But it's this ability to be real.
I think that's quite beautiful that, as you look at roots and lineages, you have to look at the really bad parts too, and that, our roots are part of who we are. They are not all of who we are.
Absolutely. Exactly.
It reminds me the fact that you are a triple University of Virginia grad.
Yes, I am.
A fine institution that has, a beautiful thing there called the Contemplative Science Center, founded by Thomas Jefferson, a very high-minded person who was also a very aggressive slaveholder.
Yes.
And
he did not found the Contemplative Sciences Center, by the way, but the University of Virginia itself.
Yes, he found right. Yes, we should be clear on that.
Yes, we should be clear on that.
So I'm wondering how you must have felt as somebody who spent so much time at the University of Virginia and got so much from it, I imagine, that when you saw what happened in Charlottesville here, I mean, how did that feel for you?
Oh, thank you for asking. It was devastating, really, because the images that were shown all around the world brought me right back to those physical locations. I, spent 8 years in Charlottesville, undergraduate law and sociology, graduate sociology. But 8 years in that community. And so every step of the march that the Tiki Torch carriers did, that's on ground I've walked probably much more than most of the people carrying those torches. The statues around which they were circled and all of that, I literally stood by, one of those statues when I first started trying to practice public speaking and gave a little speech out there. And the place where Heather Heyer was murdered, that street is one walked many times. I had a really close friend, a partner for a time who had a job right on that same street. So we would literally walk those streets. So for me, to see this place that I knew very viscerally and personally as a source of community, be taken over in service of division, and to be a site for the fomentation of that kind of very ugly underbelly that is in our culture. But to see it coming up there was really, really difficult. At the same time, it wasn't shocking in the sense that I have long known that this underbelly, this undercurrent of American culture has never gone away. So despite the fact that I was trained like everybody else to sort of believe that we had moved into a world of color blindness and post-racial this and that, I grew up in a world which told me otherwise, constantly being reminded of the different ways that race still mattered and that white supremacy and male supremacy were still desired in our country. I've lived knowing that. So seeing that was painful, but not totally unsurprised or totally surprising to me.
So, I just have a couple more questions. It's been so wonderful, as it always is, to talk with you, and I don't want it to end, but all good things must come to. I just have a couple more things though that, and you're talking about white supremacy and male supremacy. I'm reminded of the term intersectionality, and meaning that biases don't come in singular packages. you can be at the intersection of several boxes.
Yes, indeed.
In your case, as an African American woman, that's
Mhm.
just a couple of ways.
Yes.
But intersectionality is also a complicated academic intellectual term. And,
Exactly.
part of the way that we make change is by, examining and studying the world and coming up with new words and concepts and sharing those kinds of insights. And a lot of that happens in academia. But then, when it reaches beyond that, it's difficult language. If you
Yes.
don't, even if you have, academic training, you might not have academic training in that particular discipline. So it
Indeed.
becomes very hard to follow. I wonder what I find it a very interesting challenge, because I'm not saying in any way at all that, these disciplines and languages are not important and extremely helpful, but how how do you work with that? Because you are an academic and
Yes.
you are an activist as well, and
Yes.
teacher. So
Oh, another great question. It's it's something that I am right. It's right. It's a very present issue. This question of how to talk about what we're talking about in ways that bring people into the conversation and don't push them away. Um, it's a good, it's a feature of life in academia that that we do develop these terms that are, what we are using in our little world. And then when we try to come out and communicate with others, we can lose lots of people. This is a problem that all so-called elites are facing right now. That is to say, we haven't figured out well enough just how to communicate what it is that we see in the world and beyond our little circle of, concerned other parties who speak the same language. So yeah, I sometimes don't use the word intersectionality, even though I completely understand it and completely live it, because I think it is not as well understood, even by people who use it. It's a term that emerged to try and capture, as you pointed out, the reality that these patterns of othering. So that's a word that I think people understand a little bit better. And the experience of it, right, of being an other, being a person who doesn't really fit in and doesn't belong, or being a person who represents a group who is tended to be on the margin, if you will. There, using the word othering versus the phrase othering and belonging, which is something that, John Powell and others who do this work have been emphasizing. Those are words that I think capture as well something about what it is that intersectionality is meant to capture, which is there are the ways in which we are othered or made to feel unwelcome differ profoundly depending on our particular characteristics. So it's going to be different for me as a Black woman who came from a kind of a relatively poor background in terms of access to resources, including education prior to my own generation and all of that. There is a way in which being a Black woman from a poor background sort of positions me, and I would say a poor background who's now sort of moved beyond that, right? So now I've seen the other side of the class divide in my own lifetime. All of those are very unique aspects of like positioning on a sort of a very dynamic social landscape. And if we only are talking about race, we're missing the way that gender is race, or race is gender, right? So that, our experience of race has a gender dynamic to it that only others who are similarly situated really are kind of able to see in the same way. And even individuals who are all kind of Black and female, let's say, we're not experiencing the world exactly the same either. So what begins to happen is we start to push on the vast oversimplification that runs with identity conversations. There's just a lot of oversimplification that we've just gotten used to. The idea that when we say Black woman, we kind of know what that means. or when we say white male. I mean, actually, these are just the beginning. Like they're just a kind of surface, right? That might touch upon something that is an invitation, as far as I'm concerned, into like, what is it what does that mean in this person's experience? What does it mean in mine? What does it mean in yours? But I think terms like intersectional are meant to try to push us in the direction of not being so simplistic in the way that we think about these things, but we need better language because the language is a barrier.
Well, I think that I really get what you make a very good point about the intention behind having the word intersectionality is to undermine simplistic concepts that we assume have a solid meaning, a solid identity. Black woman, white man, and you can and you are finding ways to do that outside of the academic community, finding language such as simpler language like othering and belonging that can reach wider without, again, assuming that there's something wrong with the the academic language. I want to end on one note. I think I would be remiss if before we left we didn't talk about your role as an educator of lawyers, and day in, day out in your life you're educating lawyers who will go on and do things in the world. And I'd just like to end by hearing you say something about how your mindfulness work, and you've already talked about your classes, but how your mindfulness work could inform both how they practice law day in, day out, and also that much larger notion of how justice is exercised in the world, since, as Dr. King said, I don't know how the arc of history is long, but it inclines towards justice. So, anyway, what would you say about that? How mindfulness informs your role in preparing our future lawyers?
Yeah. Well, I do agree with this idea that the moral arc is long, but it bends toward justice. And I would add, you don't want to edit brilliance, but it bends because people bend it towards justice. There's no inevitability toward that. I mean, that's just a fact. So part of what I think mindfulness in law does is help prepare students for the work of bending the moral arc of the universe toward justice. It's work. And that, being a lawyer gives one a particular position. Again, it's another kind of identity, location in the world. But it gives a person a particular role, potential role to play as an advocate, as a person who assists in bridging communities, right? There's a lot of different leadership and other roles that lawyers are invited to play. A lot of that, frankly, historically, has been about maintaining these unfair systems. And so the real challenge is to be part of the system, but not fully of it, right? Be enough a part of it to understand it, but also be a kind of a place in that system, a voice, a spirit, if you will, for a different way. And so that shows up in teaching students a little bit more about how to listen to clients well, how to meet their suffering, because most people who come to a lawyer are in some form of distress or trying to avoid being in it, right? So they're either trying to prepare, right, or deal with distress. So there are concrete ways that we help lawyers by helping them listen, by helping them have emotional intelligence and empathy. Could say more about those concrete things. But at the same time, really, those of us bringing mindfulness to law are seeking to bring a different view to law, a view that recognizes nuance more effectively, all the things we've been talking about, sees paradox and can deal with both and a little bit more effectively, is aware that adversarial modes of resolving conflict are just one set of tools in the toolbox of an effective lawyer, but there are many other ways to help people resolve conflict and come together around some sort of issue of disconnect. So it's a project that is about both helping expand the sense of what it means to be a knowledgeable and skillful and grounded person who can help others in the midst of conflict and help us structure a world through law, right? So it's about expanding the skill set, but it's also about really helping prepare a new generation of people in this profession who can help us bring about a world in which, to quote King again, right, he saw justice as what love looks like in public. So that's actually, and now I'm really, that's Cornel West, who's taken King's statement of justice as justice for King was love correcting that which stands against love. So it's all about realizing that there is a role to play in bringing the kind of compassionate, caring meeting of our struggle through our systems, right? And that public face of love is what justice is all about. And so that is what I'm trying to do to kind of work with my law students. And what that looks, is something, one thing in my torts class, my personal injury class, one thing in my race law class, one thing in the retreat side co-lead for lawyers. But it is about creating a different way of being in this profession that I hope in a generation in the years beyond my lifetime will make it more of a source of loving public engagement with the challenges of life, as opposed to just adversarialness.
Well, that's a beautiful point to end on. And, it reminds me that we started earlier talking about mindfulness as being, so much more than a personal improvement project and more than just relaxing and, and what you have to say and what you do, you really embody that. And this has been such an inspiring conversation and so great to spend this kind of time with you. And I'm glad we can celebrate Mindful's 5th anniversary together like this.
Yes. Thank you so much, Barry. This has been a joy for me too. And I'm really grateful for the work that Mindful has been doing, that you've been doing in the world. So with great respect and honor for what you're doing.
Well, thank you very much. And till next time.